What is good, Tsla family? It's Ray J back with another video. And in this one, I want to break down what's going on with Tesla, SPY, Nvidia, the QQQ, and a couple of other tickers. I'm going to break down what the news is saying about Tesla, what you should be watching for as time progresses, and why tomorrow is going to be another important day as we have more bank earnings coming out, not to mention some economic data. But before I begin the devil's information, before I get into any more details, let me just mention a couple of things. Firstly, I am not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice. And also, if you guys can, please check out the Moomoo link, which is down below and in the description. If you sign up for Moomoo, the link down below, and deposit $100 into the account, you are guaranteed up to 5 free stocks. We deposited $1,000 into the account. You are guaranteed up to 15 free stocks, and the offer ends very soon. Anyways, now let's break down what's going on with the markets. Today is MLK Day, or Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I hope you guys are having a great day so far today, but the stock market is closed and it's going to be opening again tomorrow. And tomorrow is going to be another significant day because, first and foremost, for tomorrow, which is going to be Tuesday, before the market opens, we have Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, PNC, First Bank, and many other banks out there announcing their earnings. Goldman Sachs, in my opinion, is going to be the most important one. What they announce is going to have a big effect on the markets and our current view of the economy and how these companies are doing. So it's going to be very important, and we will see how things end up looking. But I do want to note that the last time the earnings came out from the banks, I would say that we had pretty mixed earnings, right? We had some beats on EPS and revenue, some misses here and there. Guidance was kind of mixed. Some banks had decent guidance, others were just like, okay. That's because the current interest rate environment is not the best for them. And with this, continuing, this could continue to affect them as time goes on. But looking at the projections, we'll be watching guidance of these banks as well, and we'll see how they do tomorrow morning. It's going to cause a big move in the markets, most likely. Besides that, all the data that's coming out is very minor. We have the New York Empire State Manufacturing Index at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's an hour before market open, which is very minor. We have Waller from the Fed giving a speech, and everything else is just not going to cause anything too crazy. We have the 3-month and the 6-month bill auctions coming out at 11:30 a.m. So I would say that at 11:30 a.m. from that period on until like noon, that's when you should be watching for some higher volatility in case the data causes anything. Besides that, it's pretty minor, and the biggest thing is going to be the bank earnings. Now, right now, the market is still at greed when it comes to its overall sentiment. We used to be at extreme greed. The market's cooling off just a little bit from here because of the fact that the market's been basing. It's not really pushing as hard as it once was. And we're going to be watching to see if this continues. Does the market get back into extreme greed if the market pushes more, or does the market end up projecting and bringing this closer to neutral and fearful? We'll be watching that very carefully. Market momentum is still extremely greedy, so be careful because generally when this happens, the market's in the topping process. And then when it comes to the put and call positioning, this thing tends to see the bottoms being hit at extreme greed when we start to see a lot of those puts being closed. Right now, we're starting to see less calls being bought and more puts being bought as shorts are piling back into the markets. And generally, when we hit this extreme level, this is when the market tops. This is when we enter this topping process, because the last time it was like mid-July when we saw this thing top, and it took just a few more weeks until the market started to sell off as we approached August. Right, so we hit the top around or I'm sorry, not the top, the bottom around December 19th, and spend just a couple of weeks as the market's still near the same levels. This suggests that the market could be topping soon. So you want to be very careful when looking at this data. The VIX is still at neutral. It hasn't broken above the 50-day moving average. We'll be watching for that as well. I'll be talking more about the VIX a little bit later on in the video. But besides that, we're still watching these things on the sidelines. I'm also going to be paying close attention to the Fed. What on earth is the market kind of projecting from the Fed? Because before, the market was anticipating a cut that's coming in March. They're thinking that the Fed is going to cut by 25 basis points in March. Now this could be adjusted because of CPI. If this starts dropping, this bar in the middle starts dropping, I think what would happen is this one would start going up, and then this would cause downside in the markets if that ends up being the case. It's just a hypothetical situation, but there's a risk of that happening because of the last CPI. So keep this in the back of your mind. We'll see if this changes. Some good news for Tesla has come out, some decent news as well. There's some news saying that Tesla gets a $94 billion reality check so far. So that's some new news that has come out, but nothing too absolutely insane. The news is basically saying that Tesla has lost more than $94 billion in market valuation in just the first 2 weeks of 2024. They're saying it's not hard to figure out why this is happening, but honestly, guys, I don't think that this has a lot to do with just fundamentals, because when you look at Tesla from a fundamental basis, it's still very strong. I think fundamentals are playing a big role in why that's happening because of the current interest rate environment, but it had more to do with lots of bad news that was coming out and the reaction we got after Tesla's big deliveries. But the news, in my opinion, is playing a bigger role. We're getting a lot of negative news from Tesla that's been coming out, right? From the things going on with Hertz to the protests around the world, not to mention the price cuts in China, rising labor costs. I mean, the list goes on. Given the current economic environment right now, this is just adding on to the risks and the downside for that reason. But I'm not going to attribute everything to just Tesla's fundamentals. I wouldn't say it's solely just that. There's just a mix of so many different factors. But that is how Tesla started off for the year. And I think that there is a risk of more downside coming, but I want to talk more about that in just a few minutes. Some good news came out. I want to talk about this as well. Tesla ranks second in customer website satisfaction according to a study. Right here, it has very good content, very informative content, lots of visual appeals, good navigation, good speed, and things like that. So good for Tesla. They do have, in my opinion, a great website. They have really good customer service, at least for the most part. There are people that do complain about the backlogs and how difficult it could be to get your hands on one of these things sometimes. But if anything, I believe that Tesla will continue to grow, and it is good that they have high customer satisfaction when it comes to their website. So not bad whatsoever. Some good news has come out. This is the news I was referring to initially. The Optimus robot is able to fold clothes. It wasn't able to build cars, at least not yet, but it is able to fold clothes, which is pretty cool. So there's actually a video, I think it was on Elon Musk's Twitter page. It just came out like minutes ago. It just came out today, right? Where they actually have the bots just folding a garment, which is very, very awesome news. Or it was folding a shirt. Its way of doing it was very unconventional, which is kind of funny, but it was able to do it. So there is progress being made. It was relatively slow, kind of shaky, to be honest with you. But there is progress being made. It's not just walking around doing nothing. It's now able to use its hands. It's able to look at a shirt and try to fold it. We're making progress. And as time goes on, give it years, guys, this thing is going to become so much more efficient, so much more useful, and you're going to be very impressed with what's about to come. So this is a good piece of news for Tesla, in my opinion. Volume was 123 million. It was selling off on volume above average, which is a little bit more bearish technically, which gives the bears a bigger edge. The short volume has gone up to about 61% of the total volume, so there's a lot of shorting going on, lots of selling pressure that still makes up Tesla's volume. Oppenheimer is saying that Tesla is going to perform with the market. They actually used to say the same thing. They're reiterating the same thing. Nothing else is changing from there. The price risk ratio is dropping because Tesla is losing relative strength. And don't forget that Tuesdays tend to be green only about 52% of the time. So we're going to be watching some critical levels from here, but that's pretty much it in terms of data. When it comes to seasonality and such, it tends to be green more around noon and also around 2 and 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So what do I see on the charts? What do I think Tesla is going to do? In my opinion, we have some critical support coming up on Tesla. I'm going to break down the support first before I break down the levels. So basically, looking at the weekly time frame, we're going to actually switch the chart just a little bit, switch over to our moving averages. Give me 1 second, guys. Tesla is approaching the 200 moving average on the weekly time frame right here. And that's actually at this 217 area right here. See the red line right here? This is what's holding Tesla up. If we lose this red line, this EMA right here, the 200 moving average on the weekly, Tesla's going to be sinking down even more. In my opinion, it could even get very close to 200. If we hold above this, there's a chance Tesla could try to just range trade for a bit or even bounce. So this is going to be a very important support, this 217 area. I'll be watching this very carefully. But I want to call out that the weekly time frame looks bearish on Tesla. Right now, the weekly looks bearish. The daily, the 4 hour, these things all look bearish to me. It's still looking very weak. And we'll have to see if Tesla could try to hold support or not. But it looks very weak, guys. Be very careful with Tesla. So when it comes to our levels, we're going to be watching resistance right here. So we have this channel to the downside that Tesla has been stuck in. We're going to be watching this very carefully to see if this holds Tesla back. We're just barely at resistance right here. If it breaks this, you're going to be watching for a test of 220 and eventually 222, 223.5, and then 225 is resistance. If we want to be bullish, you want to see it break and hold 225, and that could start to favor the bulls a bit. But we're still quite a distance away from that. If we're bearish, you want to see Tesla close below 217. If we close below 217, there's going to be more risk of downside. We have some support at 215, 213.8, 212, and then 210. Tesla could easily fall to 210 or lower if we end up losing 217, in my opinion, if we close below that. So you want to be very careful. So what do I think is going to happen? What is my opinion of Tesla from here on out? Well, generally what happens, especially during long weekends, is Tesla tends to push to the upside when we open, but the move might not last given the current volatility, the current volume, and the current technicals on Tesla. So we'll see if it breaks this yellow trend. If it breaks this, we could be looking for a pushback up to 222.5, but I'm not sure it's going to break 225 or not unless we see some good news. But the most likely possibility is Tesla kind of pushes up when we open and ends up failing and coming back down and just trades sideways within this range between 217 and 222. So look for a little pop, then a drop, and just lots of sideways price action. If we end up losing that 217 support, though, we're going to turn a lot more bearish. I'm thinking it might pop first before it ends up coming down later on. But if anything, guys, I do want to note that I am a little bit concerned about the markets. There's a risk of some downside when you look at some technicals. But just be very, very careful once I break down more charts. But for tomorrow, a pop and drop is very possible for Tesla with some sideways price action. And if we lose 217, I would turn a lot more bearish, but we have to see how it closes just to be safe. The reason why I'm being a little bit ambiguous is because of the bank earnings. I don't know for sure what they're going to cause. The last time the bank earnings came out on Friday, we actually saw the market pop first and come back down and trade sideways. So watch and see if you get another pop and a drop. So be very careful with that. Now I want to talk about Apple stock. Apple is in a very important position, which is very important for SPY, Tesla, and the QQQ. Now Apple, has a head and shoulders like structure. You want to be very careful with this. If we're bullish on Apple, you need to see this thing not just break 186.5 as resistance, but also 188. We have to break 188 to invalidate this. If we fail to do so, there's a rising wedge forming. Apple could end up sinking back down. If we lose 183.5, I think Apple's going to sink a lot lower. So you want to be very careful with Apple. The reason I'm calling it out is because Apple could dictate the whole market. It could, have a big effect on the flow of the market. So you want to be very careful. So what is very probable for Apple? Let's talk about some levels then, what I predict. We have resistance at this yellow trend line right here in the 186s to 186.5. If we break this, watch resistance around 188. Then above that, we have 189.3 and 190. For support, make sure you watch 185. If we lose that, there's 184.25. 183.5 is going to come next. That's very important. And if we lose this, we're going to be sinking much lower. I'm calling this out first because this is very important for Tesla and SPY and all these other tickers. We have a head and shoulders forming on Apple. There is a risk of downside. There's a rising wedge as well. So this favors the downside. This does favor a drop that's coming in the market, a downtrend coming over the next couple of days. It might not start immediately. It could take a few days until we start to see the downside. So just be careful. I think the most probable possibility is Apple kind of range trades a bit within this wedge, pushes a little bit higher towards 186.5, gets a little bit tight, and then breaks down and starts sinking back down to these lower levels. There's definitely a risk of that, guys. So make sure you're prepared for that. Make sure you're ready just to be safe. So with the head and shoulders on Apple, SPY has this developing. It's starting to turn, but one thing that's worth noting is that every time SPY hits 478, we tend to see this thing reject. You have this wick here, another wick here, another wick here. Be very careful on it. SPY also has a giant bearish divergence developing on the daily time frame. This time it looks very strong, especially since we're at these extremes. So you want to be very careful. I'm not saying this means we have to collapse tomorrow. I'm just saying you have to be very careful in looking at this, especially because the market is still greedy when it comes to sentiment. All right, so what do I see for SPY? It's very simple. This thing could pop again. But make sure you watch resistance. We have some very strong resistance between 478 and also at 480. Very, very strong resistance. Every time we touch this level, we get rejected. So you want to be very careful. We have resistance at 476 as well, since we're technically below that. 478 and then 480 is tight. For support, watch 475.5. 475 flat, 474 followed by 472.9. And below that, we have some tight resistance in the 471 to 472 area, followed by 470, then 468. What do I think SPY is going to do? It's very simple. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually push up again tomorrow, depending on the bank earnings. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to grab more liquidity up here at 478 to 480. We kind of trade sideways up here, and then we eventually break back down, kind of like a pop and a drop, similar to what we saw on Friday, where we kind of popped and then traded sideways. Except I think it might pop, then drop back down, and eventually I see us coming down towards 472 or so. So we might push up to 478 first. We might first grab liquidity up here. We might trade sideways up here. But then later on, whether it's tomorrow, maybe the later days of the week by Friday, I wouldn't be surprised if we come back down. We see a move to the downside, start a little downtrend. That's what I predict is going to happen. A little pop, sideways price action, and some drop that comes later on. All right, that's what I see for SPY as the most probable possibility. For the QQQ, I think something very similar could play out. We have a nice uptrend being established, and they're trying to grab liquidity up here very close to the 410s. So watch 410, 412, and 413 as some resistance levels. For support, make sure you're watching 408, 405.7, and then 404 as critical supports. We'll be watching those very, very carefully. Those are going to be very important. In my opinion, just like what I said about SPY, I think this thing might pop a little bit, grab liquidity in the 410s, very low 410s between 410 and 412, trade sideways, and eventually starts selling off towards 406 and 404 later on during the week. A pop, sideways price action, and a drop is what I'm anticipating. So be very, very careful. The market might pop tomorrow depending on the bank earnings before we end up selling off later. But that's what I'm anticipating for now. Nvidia is very tight. It's very hard to predict what it's going to do depending on which way it breaks. We have to see which way it breaks first, but I still think there's downside coming later on. Watch resistance at this yellow trend line. If we break this, there's 550, 551.6, and 552.5. For support, make sure you watch 545, 542, 540, which is very minor, followed by 536. I think there's a very good chance that as Nvidia is getting tighter, we kind of pop a little bit higher. We could try to grab more liquidity in the 550s, trade sideways, and then eventually we start to sell off towards 542 and even lower levels than that. But that's what I see for Nvidia. A little pop and drop like move. We'll see if that ends up holding, if that ends up being the case. But that's what I'm seeing for Nvidia. As far as I think I went over Tesla, SPY, Nvidia, and the QQQ, and Aapl already. But that's pretty much it for the main ones I typically go over on TradingView. Now I just want to talk about a couple more tickers very briefly. So for SoFi, this is going to be very important as well. SoFi is testing the daily 200 moving average, which actually aligns very closely with the 200 EMA. So I'm going to switch over to the EMAs. It makes almost no difference. Let me go back to the daily. The daily 200 EMA or 200 moving average, whichever one you want to use, are almost at the same level basically. That's going to be our support. If we lose this, we turn a lot more bearish. Now, there's a very good chance we have a head and shoulders like structure that's developing on it. Could pop towards 8 to 8.2 and then eventually sell off, or it might just sell off from here. But SoFi has a head and shoulders. It's a little hard to see, but we have a head and shoulders developing. There's a high probability it's going to sell off even lower as time goes on, eventually lose 7.8 and come down to 7.5 and even below that. For Microsoft, it looks a little bullish on the daily. It could push up towards 390 and then reject. So this still favors the bulls a bit more. It could push a little higher towards 390 and then reject. Watch that on Microsoft. It still is a little bit more bullish looking before we end up hitting tight resistance around 390. For AMD, this is forming kind of like a double top like structure. So if this is a flag, we could pop towards 150 and then reject and come down to 141. But I'm noting this gap down here at 138. So this could be a good short if it does end up losing support around 145. If 145 fails us and we don't get bought back up, there's a good chance it's going to come down to at least 141. If that fails us, there's a gap to fill at 138. So what do I think it's going to do? Either it pops a little bit and then it drops back down, or it just drops from here. An eventual sell-off is what I'm anticipating for AMD. The VIX is critical because the VIX is trying to base around 12.3 something. We also have critical support around 11.8. So watch 12.3 and 11.8. Could drop a little bit and then bounce, or it could just bounce from here, depending on how we react to the bank earnings and the 20 EMA. What this means for the markets is very simple. Either the market's about to get a downtrend, the market's about to start selling off, or the market's about to get a temporary pump before we sell off. That's what the VIX is telling us. We either pop a little bit first and then the market sells off, or the market sells off from where we currently are. That's what the VIX is basically suggesting as we're at support right now. The VIX might drop to 11.8 and then bounce, or just bounces from here, tries to make its way back up of 13 and eventually test the 50 moving average, and eventually make our way to the 50 EMA after that. So once again, that's what the VIX is suggesting. The dollar is very flat. It's trying to show some life now. We'll be watching to see if it breaks 102.8 or the 50 EMA. If it breaks, that could turn bullish. That could be bearish for the markets. If it breaks this yellow line right here, that's going to be bearish for the stock market. So watch that very carefully. We'll see if that ends up being the case or not. But watch that carefully. For Coinbase, if Coinbase continues to sell off since we lost the daily 50 EMA, I think that a 125 is a good target. That's where we had the support right here. I was actually looking at this. So it's 125.8 to 126, like around there is our next target. This looks bearish. Coinbase looks bearish. I think it could sell off more. There's a risk of 125.8. Google is looking like it's starting to reject. Uh, it depends on if we break below 142.94. If we lose that, it's going to sell off to 140. If it holds this, it could just range trade for now. My gut is telling me that this might actually reject, but it hasn't fully officially rejected yet. It's kind of indecisive. This kind of looks like a doji from on a daily. I could see this turn back down, but just to be safe, watch for confirmation. See if you lose 142.9, the 5 EMA. If it loses this, a bigger drop is coming to 140, then eventually 138. But there is a risk of a rejection on Google. For Amazon, there's also the same thing, a risk of a rejection. If it loses 153, close to the 5 EMA, I'm expecting it to come down to fill this gap towards, it's going to get very close to 150.6, basically, the daily 20 EMA. So if we reject and lose 153, watch for a drop towards 150.6 to 151, which is where we have that gap to fill. There's going to be a risk of a rejection on Amazon, so just be very careful. But if we want to be bullish, if it breaks 157, 160 could come. I'm not favoring the upside. I favor the downside a bit more on Amazon. Meta is still bullish in terms of its chart. It's making higher highs and higher lows. If it breaks 377, watch for 380. It's still not really rejecting yet. But if we get a rejection day tomorrow, you want to see if we form like a doji or something. If we end up losing this 370 area, 372-ish, I expect it to start selling off towards 366.8. The 5 EMA has been holding this up. If we lose 366.8, then it's going to start sinking down to much lower levels. We have a gap to fill down here at 357 in lower levels. So I would say the 5 EMA, basically wherever it is when we test it, is going to be very important for the daily. And if we lose that, it's going to start selling off. Hasn't done that yet. It's still bullish looking, so it hasn't officially sold off yet. Watch for any potential rejections between 377 and 380 on Meta. So that being said, basically for the markets, could the market push a little bit more and grab some liquidity? Yes, it can, guys. I'm not saying the market has to crash or anything like that. The market could push tomorrow to the upside. We could see, SPY hit 478 to 480. It's still a possibility. But to turn bullish, you need to try to break 478, close above that, and there's going to be some potential. But in my opinion, I don't think it's going to happen like that. I think that the market's going to grab liquidity temporarily, and then I think the market's going to start selling off. And I think that there's a sell-off coming looking at Aapl because of the head and shoulders, and looking at the current technicals on SPY as this thing is looking very shaky, kind of struggling to break above 478. So a pop and drop is what I'm predicting for most charts out there. Be very careful with Tesla. Make sure you watch the EMAs and moving averages I called out. With that being said, have an absolutely spectacular rest of the day. Enjoy your Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. And I'll see you guys very soon tomorrow morning to discuss how the bank earnings go and some other factors like that. Thank you for listening, guys. Have a great day and peace out.